Hello and welcome to another session of Karen's Colours. I'm Dr. Karen and these are my conversations in colour. This week I come to you from the beautiful shores of Hollywood. Well, not really. It's my own home, but it's a great background and it gives us an idea of what we're going to be talking about today. Firstly, though, I'd like to welcome my new subscribers. It's lovely to see you here. Welcome back to those of you who've subscribed before. This week, I'm going to be doing something a little different. Hopefully, you will enjoy this as much as you have the examination of people's colours in terms of their personality uses. This week, I'm going to be looking at my own PhD journey. This is how I examined colour in film, and what I'm going to be presenting this time is the preliminary study that I did prior to my dissertation. So let's get started. My PhD journey began with examination of colour in terms of how it affected the way in which we understood film. Now, in the beginning, the study was conducted on the films that were released in Australia. Why Australia? Well, that's where I live, and those were the films that other people here in Australia would have seen. I chose the years 1953 to 2010, which turned out to be 57 years of films that I needed to examine. Why 1953? Well, that's when the first colour films came to Australia. 2010, of course, was when I finished my studies. I sourced these films from the USA, from the United Kingdom, and those that were made in Australia. I looked at what were the top grossing films for each week in those 57 years, and that gave me a total of 2,964 potential films from which I could choose the ones I was going to analyse. Then I went about resourcing some of those films. But the reality was a little bit more difficult than the way in which I had originally envisaged looking at those films. For a start, the films were variable in their popularity. Some of them were exceptionally popular and so therefore exceptionally lucrative for the studios that produced them. Others only stayed for a week or so and were hardly seen by anyone at all, even back in 1957. The films had to be available to me in CD format. This was in the days before streaming, but also because CD format enabled me to manipulate those films in a way that was not possible through streaming. They must also be in high definition. I couldn't choose films that came from badly rendered versions. So if the film wasn't in high definition, then the colours were distorted and those had to be eliminated. Not all of those films, of course, were available in CD format. So that gave me some options to consider. I had to change my inclusion criteria. I couldn't choose every film. I had to decide to become a little bit more discriminating. So I chose the top 20 films for each year, which limited the potentials down to 1,140 possible films for review. But that required further refinement as well. All of the monochrome films had to be eliminated. Now, monochrome films mainly came from the United Kingdom in those early years. And the reason for this was that during the post-World War II years, the United Kingdom was still producing films primarily in black and white. They were very popular, but they were not in colour and so therefore useless for my purposes. I also discovered that some films contained the top spot over multiple weeks, while others were only there for a few weeks. That made a difference to their popularity, regardless of the quality of the film. It depended also on the sourcing or the releases of those films from the studios that produced them. Documentaries, for example, had to be eliminated altogether. They didn't have a narrative content, and I was looking specifically at films that told a story. Animations also had to be eliminated because animations have few or no costume changes. Once the animated character is given a color costume, they generally have that color costume throughout the entire film. That brought me down to 928 remaining films. Then I looked at how to eliminate certain genres. Films with fixed costumes had to be taken out, and that is war and space adventures, because each of these had uniforms, and regardless of the quality or value of the storyline, of the narrative of these films, the color was not something that was able to be analyzed in any detail. Color in films that were ambience based, that is, it was mainly background colors that were important, were also eliminated. So I had to get rid of all of the noir films and the horror films, because they were primarily shot with lots and lots of darkness, and darkness obscures color and also alters its value, making it very hard to compare in an analysis. Non-Caucasian films also were taken out, and this was because the costume colors are culturally defined. I was particularly interested in examining our own cultural ways of looking at color and characterization. So non-Caucasian films didn't follow those same rules. There are often too many or too few colors to analyze in non-Caucasian films. For example, Bollywood films are an absolute riot of color. Films that are based in Africa, for example, have very, very few colors indeed. That left me with 771 remaining films. So what then were the genres that were available for inclusion? Well, we had drama, comedy, action films, adventure films, films that involved romances or family-oriented films, musicals, and historical films. Those were the genres that I then examined in a little bit more detail. But the preliminary study was still too large. Musicals had to be taken out because although they were highly colourful, there were too few of them for analysis purposes. I needed to have a certain number of films that I could compare with each other. While musicals are truly wonderful as a riot of colour, they simply weren't enough of them. Comedies also had to be eliminated. They too are highly colourful, but they also have non-normative colour use. That is, they produce costume colors that no human being in an ordinary everyday situation would wear. Family films were problematic. Some of them were all right, but others had the frequent use of children. Now, children tended to be restricted or skewed in their gender attributions. The child was either a male or a female, and so they were designated specific colors, and their costume changes were also rather limited. Historical films also created a problem in that the focus is often on the costumes. That is, if the film was about, say, Queen Elizabeth I, or about events such as films Mutiny on the Bounty, for example. Now, those films were very limited in the sort of colours that were available, or they had far too many colours that were not used the way that we use them in ordinary everyday life, so therefore they were also taken out. That left me with some remaining genres that I could work with. What I looked at next was a required minimum number of 3 costume color changes for the main character. It didn't matter so much about the secondary characters, but the main character had to have 3 distinct costume color changes in order to qualify. And those costume change colors had to be normative. They had to be colors that we would expect to find the person on the street wearing in those circumstances. The focus, of course, was always on the lead character or characters. And this was because there were so many characters in some of these films, so that it was impossible to create a good analysis of the film's entirety without having to delve into minutiae. I was interested in looking at a large number of films rather than in-depth analysis of an individual film, at this stage anyway. Supporting characters were included for their coloured costumes as they were required in the plot. They were also then chosen specifically for their target audience. And here we find that romantic comedies marketed to females were a very good source of films to use because there were many of them. And similarly, there were many action adventure films which are marketed primarily to males. That already gave a gender division between the types of attraction that these films gave to their audiences, and that made it even easier to differentiate between the color costumes that were going to be used in these films. A film that is marketed to men is hardly likely to be popular if the main characters are wearing the sorts of colors that no man would ever wear, for example. So then I had to look at a method for analysis. Well, firstly, I looked at all of the CDs of these films viewed at double speed. The reason for this is that it eliminates all of the verbal and noise content. I wasn't interested in listening to the film. I was interested in looking at how color changed. The focus was on those costume color changes. So if the costume of the lead character had a change in color, then that was noted down. It only followed the primary characters. Usually that was only one or two main characters in the film. Sometimes it was up to 5 main characters. It depended on how many characters there were of great importance to the plot. The color changes were noted for every film and every character, and subsequent actions recorded. Now, in doing so, it showed that there were links between the colors that appeared and the actions that followed, which gave an interesting predictive aspect to the plot elements. I wondered at this stage, was it possible to predict what was going to happen in the film if the color appeared? Because colors always appear in costumes before the action occurs. Then I had to examine ways of talking about these films. And we know, for example, that romantic comedies are generally given a fairly nasty pejorative. They present either male or female lead characters, and mainly it is female-led characters. They are relationship interests, so they have to do with the gendered ways in which characters interact with one another. And the focus on those gender interactions is the one that is primarily of importance in the analysis. The resolution of all romantic comedies is that love is requited. The two people who start off perhaps in love and then break off and then go back together again, or don't like each other at the beginning of the film and by the end of the film are a happy ever after couple, is the purpose of these romantic comedies. They're called chick flicks, and chick flicks is a bit of a pejorative because it's supposed to make them less important. An action adventure film has mainly male lead characters. There were very few that had female lead characters, and when they did, the female tended to act pretty much the same way as one would expect a male lead character to act. The hero of these films can also be an anti-hero. It doesn't have to be a good person to start off with, can be someone who has qualities that are considered less than perfect, but by the end of the film, they are all seen as heroes, regardless of how they began at the beginning. Females are very rarely seen in these action adventures, and if they are there, then they are ancillary to the plot. The stories are all about conquest. There is a problem to be resolved, and so the hero is enjoined to go out and solve that issue. The focus is in overcoming those challenges, and sometimes those challenges are very difficult. The resolution of these films is always redemption of the primary character. If he started as a hero, then he is lauded for his efforts. If he started as an anti-hero, then he is no longer viewed as a reprehensible character by the end of the film. Now, these films are just as formulaic as the chick flicks, so I gave them their own pejorative. I called them dick flicks. Dick flicks tend to have a very limited palette when it comes to how many character colors there are for their costumes. Primarily, they occur in achroma. That is the black, white, grey continuum. And it's not always the black, white, grey that we saw in the monochrome films, although the same emphasis grew out of these. In a monochrome film, originally, the hero wore the white hat and rode the white horse. The villain had the black hat and rode the black horse. In a modern coloured film, those colours can be reversed. And often, when we have a character who is an anti-hero, there will be a fair amount of grey because we don't really know, is this person a hero or is he a villain? Blue and brown also appear quite frequently in dick flicks, but they are secondary colours and they have some very specific purposes. For example, they are dependent on whether or not the blue or brown are worn on the main or the supporting role. Red, on the other hand, appears rather rarely, and when it does, it has a very special function. It's associated with the portrayal of risk, and usually that risk is to the primary character. The other hues are very rare to appear within any of these dick flicks. If you have a female character, however, then she is likely to be the bearer of those different colours. Achroma tends to situate the primary protagonist. Thus, once the hero and the villain are given their particular colour, they rarely change position. If the hero starts off in black, he will end in black. If the villain starts off in grey, he will end in grey. There is no way in which they will swap their colours in any of these dick flicks. Blue is always a colour that's associated with verbal information. Blue is the speaker. If he is the main role, then he has some sort of pacifist stance in which he will try and talk his way around the problem or the challenge that he faces rather than fight his way through it. On the other hand, if the blue is worn by a supporting character, then this character has the role of being an information giver. Often this appears as someone who will give some vital information to the hero that allows the hero then to continue on his quest with added knowledge. If the blue appears on a female character, however, she's nearly always engaged in some form of domestic activity. Brown is the independent person. Now, when brown is worn by the main character, then this person has a very reluctant engagement with the challenge. He doesn't want to get involved. He tries to avoid getting involved, but nevertheless, involvement is foisted upon him. If it is a supporting role, then often the brown is worn by the leader of the antagonists. It's usually someone who will guide his henchmen to do all of the dirty work while he himself remains in the background or leads them on without ever actually being involved directly in the fights that occur. Red, on the other hand, has a great deal of significance. If the red comes as a sign on the hero's costumes, then he has lost some blood, but he will recover. It indicates that he is struggling at the moment. This is often the crisis point in the film, where he is fighting for his life or doing something that causes the challenge to be almost insurmountable. The supporting role that wears red tends to die or loses whatever battle it is he is engaged in. If it is the villain who is wearing red, then this demonstrates his aggression or his defeat. And the first death that occurs in any of these dick flicks is always that of a secondary character wearing red. If the red occurs in a female role, then she is sexually available or in some other way usurping the role of the hero. She's always put in her place if she wears red. In chick flicks, the colours are different. There's no specific colour linked to type of character. Black tends, however, to represent some sort of repressed anger or repressed passion, so the woman is withdrawn. If she's wearing white, then she's reflecting her desire for something in her life that she hasn't got as yet. If she's wearing red, then she's portraying some sort of domination in the relationships in which she is engaged. Green, which doesn't appear very often, but when it does in a costume, indicates jealousy or some sort of evil intention. If she's wearing blue, then she will be engaged in some sort of maternal or nurturing activity. And if she's wearing brown, then she's demonstrating an absolute disinterest in relationships. She will often start off wearing brown at the beginning of a chick flick, but by the end of it, she has changed into a more female-friendly colour. Now, magenta is an interesting colour that appears quite frequently in chick flicks, and although it's not one of the basic colour terms that we've studied previously, it does have a fair amount of importance in these films. It's a red-violet, and as such, it's often confused with pink because it is a very vibrant form of pink. And it demonstrates in chick flicks a goal orientation. The female wearing magenta wants something, she hasn't got it yet, but she's working on a plan to achieve it. It's her way of demonstrating power. Pink, on the other hand, is unrequited love. I've lost something, usually it's my love interest, and so therefore I'm now sad and I'm yearning for it. The rare colours that sometimes appear in chick flicks, but not very often, are firstly orange. Now, this generally appears as an adjunct in a mixture of colours in a costume. So orange would be flashes of orange in that colour costume rather than as a full costume itself. It generally indicates some sort of danger, particularly if it appears in the background. Purple is another colour that's not used very often, and it often indicates some sort of sudden aggression or a change in the plot that swings the plot around in a different direction. As an ambience colour, that is a colour in the background, it indicates death of some sort of character. And because chick flicks are not often associated with death, it's very rare for this to occur. Purple occurs far more likely in horror films as an indicator of death. Grey is another colour that's rarely used in chick flicks, and it generally indicates a reluctant love interest. This is one who is disinterested, doesn't want to engage, is quite prepared to continue her life without ever being bothered by the other gender, and it often is accompanied by brown. Brown and grey tend to go together to indicate this person is not seeking a relationship, is not interested in finding one. Most female costumes, however, involve multiple colour palettes. So we don't have very often that the costume has only one colour. It's also interesting that there is an equal distribution of the colour use across both main and supporting roles within a chick flick. Unlike a dick flick where the colours are very specific to the role being portrayed, in chick flicks, the colours appear on anybody. Male roles within chick flicks are often restricted to the achroma, that is the black, white, grey combinations, blue and brown. We don't very often see any other colours, and very, very rarely is red appearing at all anywhere on a male character within a chick flick. So in summary, the analysis that I did compared similar films, like films with like films. And in the end, I ended up having 100 of each. The dick flicks tended to use limited colour palettes, and this also tended to limit the number of characters that were necessary for the plot. In chick flicks, on the other hand, there were many, many colours that were used, and it accommodated many characters. The costume colours always indicate what sort of performance is expected in that particular film. So gender attributes are very evident. Males have certain colours that they are restricted to. Females are a riot of colour, and these tended to show various different ways of being those characters. Finally, and the thing that I found most interesting about this preliminary study was that colour in films, particularly in costume colours, have a predictive value. Because the colour appears before the action, if you're looking at films at twice the speed, you can look at a colour that appears and tell exactly what's going to happen next. I hope you've enjoyed this preliminary foray into colour analysis of films. I intend to do an entire series based on individual films where I'll be doing a deep dive into every one of them to look at just what it is about those films that make their colours significant, particularly the colours of the costumes that are being worn. I hope you'll find that of interest and will join me as we go through just how one analyses colour in Yates films. Join me, please. And if you have any films that you particularly would like to have analysed, then comment below and I'll see if I can get hold of it for you. Until I see you next time, bye.